It was October 1st of 1967, and the campus of Montauk University sat quiet and still in the new morning hours. The sky was dark, street lamps bright, and all students living on campus were asleep. Except, of course, for two figures who sauntered down the sidewalk towards the campus radio tower. A puny little man hauled his long carrying case and walked behind the twisting, dancing clown that joined him. It was October 1st of 1967, and Dennis Wesley wanted the pressure around Harold Buchanan's brain to squeeze out of the dime-sized hole that Dennis would leave in his skull. Now that beautiful morning air kissing the skin of his cheeks as he hauled his rifle bag into the parking lot of the radio tower, he could almost taste the satisfaction on his tongue. "Ant, ant, ant," he whispered. The nearly silent words crept and bounced off the cement walls of the stairwell as he climbed further and further. He felt the weight of his cargo press and rub against his shoulder, and he pushed his glasses further up the bridge of his nose. Bogo had already been standing on the first platform before the next set of stairs, the makeup on the clown's face showing pale under the fluorescent lights wired into the concrete ceiling. Dennis looked at his friend, watching as his silk glove crooked a finger and beckoned him further. "I know, buddy. I know. It's the asthma." Bogo nodded, silently mocking an impression of someone struggling to breathe, hands around his neck. "Very funny, Bogo." It was Bogo's idea to get up to the tower early. Dennis hadn't realized how many watchmen were on the lookout for guys with guns after the Texas University incident the year before. Funny, though, Bogo knew that the shift change around 5 o'clock was empty today. Bogo knew that Eric Grayson, night guard on campus, would be calling out sick due to a nasty hangover he'd earned the night before. Good old Bogo, always a step ahead. Dennis watched the back of the clown's striped red coveralls as one step followed another, all the while listening to the sweet melody whistled from between the clown's lips. "I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy. She's my Yankee Doodle joy." The song reminded Dennis of his father, and he laughed to think of how proud the old soldier would be seeing his only son holding that World War II rifle in victory over all those damn ants below. "Can't let them bully you, boy. They're all just horses. They pull the tractor. You run the farm. You understand?" And Dennis did. His father ran the farm, his grandfather had ran the farm, and now it was Dennis's turn to show the world what his family was about. Nobody else seemed to understand, though. That was the trouble. Coming into university, he expected to be greeted by those simpleton legacy children with open arms. But that hadn't been what happened. No, instead he found a hall built in his grandfather's name, being led by one of those lowly damn horses. It was the college's fault, of course. They'd been so proud to grant the idiot entry into such a refined and dignified school. Now the grunt was playing president over all the functions of the fraternity. Dennis should have been leader of the party. It was his birthright, after all. He had daydreamed of late-night wine parties and tennis matches dominated by his expert form and strategy, but instead he was let low under the boot of some troglodyte. He had no family, he had no legacy. But there he was all the same, the apple of every girl's eye and the best friend of every member in the fraternity. Some dumb twist of fate had robbed Dennis of that shining spot in the hall named after his family. Some dumb luck placed upon a stupid low-class nobody. But Dennis would rectify this. Dennis had remembered what his father did when his crew boys got too rowdy when the dip happened in '59. They wanted time off. They wanted benefits. But nobody wanted anything after the fire at Plant B. No, sir, just like his father had said, there are worse things they could worry about. Not a peep after that, no, sir. Things went along according to plan. So Dennis decided to give his problem something worse to worry about. As he rounded that final turn and saw the door to the roof, Bogo held it open with an arm, the other guiding a path to the outside, while the clown humbly grinned ear to ear. Dennis returned his smile. "A lot of fireworks going off today, buddy." There was that cold morning air again. It spilled into the building and spat against the thin fabric of Dennis's button-up. The sky was dark. The tops of pines around Campus Square lined the black spread on the horizon. He noticed a dome of hot yellow light crowning the mountains in the east, and Dennis smiled. He stepped through the doorway. Dennis took a seat on the lip of the tower roof, planting the ass of his slacks onto the white brick and feeling the morning dew that had clung to it seep into the cloth. He shivered, feeling a gust of wind whip his hair to the side and fog the lenses of his glasses. He looked down below, seeing the streetlights outside the fraternity house and the old university building light the ground below in a blanket of orange. Despite the black above, rising out of sheer spite from the dark was the telltale arms of the sun reaching out from the horizon. He'll be out here soon, Dennis thought. He'll come out of those old doors and slip out onto the sidewalk for his morning run. The sweaty ape. Then I'll pop him. Dennis laughed to himself. He'll turn off like a burnt battery right there in the street. Yes, sir. He'll be alone on the asphalt, leaking into a big puddle all alone. A quiet nothing gone away. That's all. Dennis thought of a joke and turned to Bogo, who was busying himself with setting the rifle to exact measures and testing the sight. It'll be a big red parade, Bogo, right down the street, said Dennis, and he laughed again. Bogo turned to him with a brow flat with disinterest and nodded with a half-hearted grin. Dennis repeated himself under his breath. Ant, ant, ant. Dennis met Bogo the day of his 7th birthday. It had been a quiet, dead afternoon when Dennis had spotted the old clown pretending to tend to the roses in his mother's beautiful garden. Dennis had been wearing a small party hat that the groundskeeper had given him that morning, the only gift he'd received or would receive. Dennis had asked his mother to send invitations to his classmates to decorate the house with streamers and candles. But she hadn't. When he'd woken that morning, it was all he could do not to cry when he found the great white walls of the estate just as bare as they had been the day before. No one came to the door. No one called to wish him a happy birthday. But Dennis had found the one thing his parents had apparently not forgotten, standing in the thicket of plush rose hedges: a clown. When he introduced the man to his parents, they sent him off to his room for playing a bad joke. When Bogo displayed his incredible talent for balloon animals to the children at school, they all just ignored him. They cruelly shunned and mocked the poor little boy until he decided that they weren't worth the effort anyway. When Dennis had finally begun high school, he'd already accepted his friend's invisibility. Bogo was a friend that was his and only his. Bogo would paint, cast shadow puppets, and tell Dennis stories to lull him to sleep nightly. Bogo was always there, and Dennis didn't care if no one else wanted to be by his side. As Dennis stared out to the doors of the old colonial fraternity, Bogo waddled over and sat next to him on the brick. He let the barrel of the rifle rest against the crook of his elbow like a sleeping infant, and the clown pursed its lips and mocked a game of peekaboo with the firearm. The clown's big white party hat swayed in the breeze, and a silk glove reached in vain for it as the wind carried it away and down to the street below. Bogo puffed his cheeks and frowned like an angry toddler, blowing a raspberry at his fallen piece of attire as it tumbled with the pine needles and leaves on the sidewalk. Ah, that's okay, buddy. I'll get you another one. Dennis reached over and patted Bogo on the shoulder, who nodded and pretended to wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. The two sat there as the sun finally peeked its face over the mountains. Then suddenly the old door of the frat house swung open with the screech of rusty hinges. Dennis felt Bogo's hands wrap around his shoulders in excitement, and both looked on eagerly as the bare legs of Harold Buchanan stepped out onto the porch. Clad in navy blue shorts and a striped blue headband, he stretched both of his arms out across the yard, breathing deep and leaning down to touch his toes. Harold reared back up with a shiny smile, beaming towards a squirrel he spotted sitting on the branch of a tree in the yard. He breathed in again, gazing at the quiet windows of the university building. Dennis watched the shape of Harold come clearer as the light grew with the sunrise. He looked at Harold's broad shoulders and his chiseled jaw, and Dennis scowled with hatred. Dennis wrenched the rifle from Bogo's arms without so much as a glance, and he readied the butt of the gun against his shoulder. Bogo clapped happily and jumped up from his seat, silently hopping up and down in a dance behind Dennis's back. The sight stood tall an inch or two away from Dennis's retina, and his pupil drew large as he focused in on the broad forehead of Harold Buchanan. The cool cobalt steel of the trigger greeted the palm of his forefinger. Harold pulled up his knee-high socks and tightened the knots on both of his cream-white Converse. Dennis stared at that little face from so many yards away. watching as Harold's shoulders dipped and his knees bent inward, ready to start his jog. The century-old bricks that stood in unison on every wall of the campus building carried the enormous echo of that shot and blasted it against every pine tree and blade of grass for maybe a mile. Dennis didn't breathe for almost too long. He felt those puffy gloves wrap around his shoulders, and Bogo's face slid side by side with his own, teeth bared and eyes wide. They both stared down at the white lines of the street below, as the crimson rim of a rushing pool slid over the paint and shone red against the morning light. The front of Harold's body kissed the green grass. A warm steam drifted up from the matter of his brain that splattered and caked the sidewalk beside him. All that was, or ever would be, of Harold Buchanan lay sprawled on that lawn in a contorted pose, limbs splayed out like an artisanal marble statue. Dennis stared down at the empty thing he'd struck to the ground, and he saw the barrel of the gun shake in his grip. He felt his own pulse skip a beat. His organs seemed to halt all activity. He felt the alien sensation of a bead of sweat drift down the curvature of his temple and over his cheek. What was that? A pit? A big peach pit growing in his chest? What a horrible, disgusting rot. But despite his discomfort, the feeling grew until it was a series of vines reaching through the bones of his arms and legs. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, and Dennis felt his stomach churn. He collapsed to his knees, spewing his breakfast onto the concrete roof of the radio tower. He stared down at the mess and heaved in helpings of air, trying to keep the second course from following the first up his throat. He heard something then. He jumped as a deafening scream shot from the street, and he turned his twitching head to see a woman frantically jogging to the corpse across the road. The door to the sorority house across the way stood open, the heads of two other ladies poking out of the dark inside. The woman frantically shook the body, begging Harold to wake up. He, of course, did not. "Call the police, Sarah." And the head of who Dennis assumed was Sarah dipped back into the living room of the home as she ran for the phone. He turned back to see the woman weeping into her bathrobe, whispering how okay everything was going to be to Harold's deafened ear. Dennis watched her kind face shedding every last drop of comfort she could into the empty thing, and Dennis's brow fell as he considered the painting of it all. It wasn't hate bubbling up in there. No, he just wondered why it was never him. And as the shrimp sat in his mess and measured his breaths, he was reminded that it could be. After all, he had Bogo. As a series of angry tears streamed down his cheeks, Dennis felt the air suddenly thicken. Something dark moved in his periphery, and Dennis turned his head to his trusted friend. Bogo's eyes were wide, almost bulging. His pupils sank into the white until they were little black pins on a pale ocean. His teeth were bright, and his lips curled to reveal each of them as they stood as slats in a great big grimace. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't anything Dennis could recognize. He watched the clown's shoulder bob up and down as its breaths frantically repeated. Dennis never left his friend's face, not even when those silk gloves shoved the rifle into his lap, and he felt a bruise start up where it hit. The clown slowly brought his pointer finger up and laid it out over the edge of the roof. Dennis followed it and saw he was pointing at the woman below. Dennis looked at the woman, her frizzled hair waving back in the wind as she clutched her robe to her sides and wept over the corpse. Then he looked back at the clown. Its face was rabid and excited, and its pointer finger swung back between them as Bogo lightly tapped on the tip of Dennis's nose. He felt those tendrils of dread wrap around his stomach and squeeze as he realized what Bogo wanted. Dennis shook his head, the sweat beginning to chill against his face. Buddy, no, I can't." But the clown insisted. He bobbed his head up and down slowly, never blinking. His arms wrapped around Dennis's shoulders, and Dennis's neck cracked as the clown swung him around to face the street again, jerking his arms up and holding his finger to the trigger of the rifle. Dennis turned his head and stared at the clown, feeling tears start up again. He watched Bogo's chest heave in and out, but now with his face pressed against Dennis's, he realized that no breath came from the clown's mouth. Bogo pointed at the lady again and then pulled Dennis's eyelids open with his slender, gloved fingers. Dennis felt the muscle around his eyeball start to rip, and something warm started to drip down the bridge of his nose. Something that wasn't tears. "Bogo, buddy, please." Bogo didn't move. Cold wind slapped their faces as Dennis tried to release himself from the clown's grip. "Bogo, I don't want to. Let me go." Dennis flailed his skinny arms and pushed away from his friend, stumbling a few steps away and faced the clown. The rifle hung limply from his hand, the butt scraping against the concrete. Bogo's shoulders shook, and he brought his fist to the sides of his head and pounded over and over, staring into Dennis's eyes. Dennis's words sputtered cowardly from his lips. "Buddy, please, don't do that." The clown stepped towards Dennis, teeth bared and fists clenched. With one quick movement, he balled Dennis's shirt collar in his hand and pulled the boy up into the air, hoisting him so that his leather shoes dangled above the ground. Dennis stared back into his friend's eyes with a kind of fear that he had never felt before, never having seen anything so explosive from the clown in all those card games and play dates in their years together. And the weight between them hung there in the morning light, the weeping woman below and the distant call of sirens being the only sound between the two. Then, as Dennis's pathetic yelps of sorrow wetly moaned from his pouting lips, he saw the clown's red lipstick spread ear to ear in a smile. Dennis reached up and wiped hot tears and snot and blood from his cheeks, and he felt a smile grow on his face too, as he finally felt his friend come back to him. Kimberly Van Houten stood above the mangled body of Harold Buchanan. The cold air brushed against her plush bathrobe, but she didn't shiver. She was freezing, but refused to give in to the urge to run back inside the sorority house and sit by the fireplace. The boy she stood above was dead, sure, but he wouldn't be alone. No, she wouldn't let this poor thing all alone before help came. She couldn't offer much, but she could give him that. Red and white lights spun from somewhere up the street, and Kimberly saw the ambulance finally run its tires towards her from the mouth of University Avenue. Finally, help was here. She raised an arm, waving the vehicle over. As the brakes squeezed on the ambulance and it squealed to a stop, she bent down to the boy at her feet. "I'm here, okay?" And she brushed the hair from those cold, hollow eyes in the boy's head and wiped another tear from her chin with her other hand. As the paramedics stepped out of the vehicle, all three people heard an earth-shattering splat on the road behind Kimberly. All of them turned, startled and groaning at the sight that met their eyes. The shattered body of Dennis Wesley twisted in a heap on the black asphalt. Wide streaks of gunk and blood spread from his orifices, and a pile of brain spewed from the crater that now made up the back of his skull. Dennis's glasses still stuck to the bridge of his nose, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His limbs were cracked and wrenched into ungodly positions, each bent like a scrunched radio antenna. The paramedics walked forward first while Kimberly brought her hands to her mouth and screamed again. As the medical personnel stared at the mess in front of them, something caught one of their eyes. He turned his head to watch something spin in the breeze and roll onto the lawn of the fraternity house across the street, and he crooked his brow. Two bodies lay before them, and yet he couldn't take his eyes off of a large white party hat that rolled to a stop at the base of a large oak tree. The medic shook his head, spitting onto the ground. What a way to start the week.